thank you for being here today. So I would first like to welcome Deacon Andrew Williams to the podium. He's going to welcome all of you on behalf of Macedonia Missionary Baptist Church.
I'd like to say good evening to each and every one of you. On the behalf of our pastor, Timothy Troxler, we'd like to welcome each and every one of you to come and to fellowship, and we hope that this will be a great experience for each and every one of us to learn more about things that are happening within our city. So we just like to say welcome. Amen.
I suppose I should tell you all who I am, huh? My name is Amanda Lankard. I'm the CEO of the Battle Creek Area Association of Realtors. Oh, thank you. So when we started this about 6 or 7 months ago, we originally thought, wow, wouldn't it be great if we could get 50 people in a room to talk about this? And you guys completely exceeded our expectations. So thank you for being here. This is an important topic to our community and across the nation. So give yourself a round of applause. So I've been asked, why? Why did you bring Mr. Rothstein here? Why is this a topic that we need to talk about? And I think it's important to share some of the history that's happened right here in our community. In 2016, there was a fair housing investigation that was conducted in Battle Creek. And through that investigations, there were patterns of difference in treatments to African Americans in our community. Our real estate agents were it shocked. We wanted to know who it was. We wanted to know where it was happening, because in this day and age, this shouldn't be happening. And from the African American community, they were angry, they were frustrated, and they were hurt. So we know that there's more work to be done in this community, and as realtors and real estate agents in our community, we want to make sure that this is a place where people want to live. We want you to buy a house in our community. We want you to buy a house in Calhoun County and in Battle Creek. So in response to the investigation, I was newer to the organization, and Rothstein, the color of law came up in numerous circles with the Fair Housing Center. So I thought, well, I wonder what it would take to bring Mr. Rothstein here. So this has truly been a collaborative partnership with the City of Battle Creek, with Willard Library, with Kellogg Community College, and I'll go through my thank yous here pretty soon. But in response to the investigation, the Battle Creek Area Association of Realtors said, hey, you know what, we should do some fair housing trainings for our realtor members. We want to make sure that everyone is trained properly, and we want to be proactive in addressing this. We also partnered with the Center for Diversity and Innovation out of Kellogg Community College to hold some implicit bias trainings. And the City of Battle Creek held several community conversations, one of them right here in this very church, with people in the community to ask them, what should we do about this? So through those conversations, a series of action items were created, and we're working on them. One of them is to bring more education to the community, and that's why we decided to put all of this together. So before we get started, I want to say thank you to Macedonia Missionary Baptist Church. They are granting us this beautiful facility in which to have this conversation and to eat dinner, so thank you there. And did you guys enjoy dinner tonight? So Kimberly Bennett from Taste Delicious Catering provided all the food tonight. Thank you to Sacred Conversations, TRHT, and the Truth and Titus Collective, and Chris and Talia for helping to facilitate and put together the pre-event, which happened last week. We originally thought we would have 20 people, 40 people RSVP'd, and we had 65. So we totally underestimated on all accounts, but that's a good problem to have. Thank you to the City of Battle Creek's Community Development Department. If you haven't had a chance, take a look at all of these maps up here. It shows some really important data. And then we had some financial contributors and planning partners for the event. Like I said, we spent about 6 or 7 months really talking and thinking through what might this look like for our community. So Beverly from Habitat for Humanity, Rosemary and Kimberly from the Battle Creek Coalition for Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, TRHT, Chris from the City of Battle Creek, Charlie, Chris, and Katina from the Fair Housing Center of Southwest Michigan, Jorge from Kellogg Community College, Nancy from Neighborhoods, Inc., Josh from Voces, Leah, Matt, and Mac from Willard Library. BC Vision was a funder. The City of Battle Creek was a funder for this event. Binda Foundation was a funder. And the National Association of Realtors provides many different grant opportunities to increase opportunities for housing, and we applied for a grant through them. So it's truly been a collaborative process, and I want to thank all of you for being here. You'll see throughout the night there are many of us that will be up here talking on the microphone, taking bits and pieces of things. This is not just an event by the Battle Creek Area Association of Realtors. I really want you to know that this has been very collaborative. So, as you sat down tonight, you have a pen, you have an index card, you have a sheet that talks about changing deed restrictions, and you have a list of upcoming events. As Mr. Rothstein is talking, if you have a question, please take a minute to jot it down on the index card, and we will be collecting those as he's speaking, because we will have a chance for Q&A at the end of his presentation. Now, some of you have multicolored index cards, and some of you have white. That doesn't mean anything, only that we ran out of white index cards and you get colored index cards. So I think I've said all of my thank yous. Now I'd like to introduce Jorge from Kellogg Community College, and he will be introducing Mr. Rothstein.
Good evening, everyone. One more logistical thing in terms of the index cards. We have some volunteers that are going to be walking around the room. If you could hold your cards up so people can see who the volunteers are. So we'll be going around as Mr. Rothstein speaks, and that way we can collect the cards and theme them so we can expedite the question process. So it is my pleasure to introduce Richard Rothstein, who is a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute and a fellow of the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund of the Haas Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. Besides being the author of The Color of Law, Mr. Rothstein is also the author of Grading Education, Getting Accountability Right, Class in Schools, Using Social, Economic, and Educational Reform to Close the Black-White Achievement Gap, and The Way We Were, Myths and Realities of America's Student Achievement. Other recent books include The Charter School Dust-Up, Examining the Evidence on Enrollment and Achievement, and All Else Equal, Are Public and Private Schools Different? So as you can see, Mr. Rothstein has been paying a whole lot of attention over his years to the issue of equity and social justice. So it is my pleasure to welcome Mr. Rothstein to the stage.
Thank you, Jorge. And Amanda, thank you. And thanks to all of you for coming here this evening to engage in this conversation with me. It's really an honor and a privilege for me to be here with this very inspiring group and to learn, as I have for the last few minutes, about some of the very important and inspiring things that you're doing. Let me begin by reminding you, all of you, that we had a civil rights movement in this country in the mid-20th century. It began by challenging segregation in law schools because civil rights lawyers believed that if judges couldn't understand anything else, they might be able to figure out that you couldn't get a good legal education in a segregated law school. And they won that. Law schools came to be desegregated, and they used that that precedent to challenge segregation in colleges and universities. And then they went on, as all of us know, to abolish segregation in elementary and secondary schools in the Brown versus Board of Education decision of 1954. And then Brown, that decision inspired a lot more activity. Civil rights activity picked up, not just with lawsuits, but with marches and demonstrations and civil disobedience. Some people lost their lives in that struggle. And by the 1960s, we had abolished segregation in lunch counters and water fountains and buses. You all know the story of Rosa Parks and interstate transportation and public accommodations of all kinds. And then the civil rights movement folded up its tent, went home, and left untouched the biggest segregation of all. The biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. Every one that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were either mostly white or all white, clearly defined areas that were mostly African American or all African American. The civil rights movement decided that segregation was wrong, it was immoral, it was harmful to both African Americans and to whites. It was inconsistent with our self-conception as a democracy, and yet we left untouched the biggest segregation of all. How could that be? And it's something I wondered about for a long time. How is it that we ended it without addressing the biggest segregation of all? In one sense, it's not so difficult to at least understand. If we abolish segregation in lunch counters or buses or water fountains, the next day anybody can go to any restaurant, sit at any lunch counter and drink from any water fountain or sit anywhere you want on a bus. But if we abolish segregation in neighborhoods, things wouldn't look much different the next day. It's a lot tougher. Doesn't make it any less harmful, any less immoral, any less unconstitutional, but it's harder. And so what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, I include myself, I'm not putting anything on you that I don't put on myself. What we've done, all of us, African Americans, whites, Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, we've adopted a rationalization, an excuse that we give ourselves for not having addressed the biggest segregation of all. And that excuse goes something like this. It's a myth we've adopted. The excuse goes something like this. Well, all those other forms of segregation that we adopted, that we abolished in the 20th century, those were all created by government. Those were the product of law, of ordinances, of regulations by government. And obviously, if government did all those things, there was a violation of the Constitution, a violation of the 5th and the 14th Amendment, and we had to reform those. We had to remedy them. We had to stop them. But residential segregation, that we said is different. That wasn't created by government. Residential segregation just sort of happened. It happened because, white homeowners who were bigoted wouldn't sell homes to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or real estate agents, or banks, acting in the private economy, not agents of government, discriminated in how they issued mortgages or whether they wouldn't issue mortgages for African Americans in either black or white communities. Or maybe it's just that people like to live with each other of the same race. Whites like to live with whites, blacks like to live with blacks, sort of a natural human thing. Or maybe it's because there are income differences. African Americans typically have incomes that are on average lower than whites, not all, but on average. And so they just can't afford to move into middle-class white communities. All of these individual, personal activities, private actions, is what's created residential segregation. And we say, if residential segregation was not created by government, if it was just an accident, a combination of private activities, well, it can only unhappen by accident. We think it's too bad, but we haven't taken on any responsibility to do anything about it, because we, as a collective unity as a country, as a nation, didn't actually create it. It just sort of arose. Well, we've given a name to this rationalization. We say what we have is de facto segregation. Segregation that happened in fact. I'm sure you've all heard that term, de facto segregation. We all use it. And what I'm going to speak to you about tonight is that it's an utter myth. There is no such thing as de facto residential segregation. The residential segregation that we have in every metropolitan area in this country was created by government in an unconstitutional fashion, a violation of the 5th, the 13th, and the 14th Amendments. It's as much a civil rights violation as the segregation of water fountains or buses or lunch counters. And if that's true, and if I persuade you that's true this evening, then I also have to persuade you that if it's a civil rights violation, we all have an obligation to remedy it, to undo it. That's what our Constitution requires. Well, as you heard from that list of other books that I've written from when Jorge read them to you, I used to spend all my time talking about education policy. I didn't know much about housing. I still don't know much about housing. I'm learning. But I was writing about education policy. And I came to understand that the biggest cause of the achievement gap in schools between black and white children was the social and economic conditions that children came to school with. And for example, I wrote many, many articles. I was the education columnist at the New York Times for a while, and wrote many articles explaining why, on average, not all, but on average, African-American achievement was lower than white achievement in this country. For example, I had one column I wrote explaining that in metropolitan areas and urban areas in this country, African-American children have asthma at 4 times the rate of middle-class white children because they live in more polluted neighborhoods. They live in less well-maintained buildings. When they have asthma, they're frequently up at night, wheezing. They come to school the next day drowsy, maybe sleepless, maybe absent. And I tried to explain that if you had 2 groups of children who are equal in every respect, identical groups of children, this is what social scientists do. They compare identical groups of children, equal in every respect, except one group has a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group inevitably is going to have lower average achievement. It's not that some children with asthma don't have higher achievement than typical children without asthma, because there's a distribution of outcomes for every human characteristic. But on average, if you've got a group of children who's coming to school drowsier and more sleepless and less often, they're going to have lower achievement, no matter how high their teachers' expectations are. We had a national policy in those years called No Child Left Behind, which said the only reason that there's an achievement gap is because teachers have low expectations. And I thought that was nonsense, and I tried to explain why. It's not just asthma, it's lead poisoning from living in more polluted neighborhoods and less well-maintained homes. It's homelessness. Take 2 groups of children, one of whom is homeless and the other group is living in secure dwellings. That first group is going to have lower average achievement. Stress from economic insecurity, from more frequent parental unemployment. All of these things create lower average achievement. But I began to reason that not only do all of things create lower average achievement, but we can take children who have these social and economic challenges, and you concentrate them in single schools and in single classrooms. It's inevitable that those schools are not going to have as high student achievement as schools where children come to school well-rested and without lead poisoning and not under great stress and not homeless. The achievement gap becomes easy to understand when you think about these kinds of causes. Well, schools today are more segregated than they have been at any time in the previous 45 years in this country. And the reason they're more segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. Most children go to neighborhood schools, and if their neighborhoods are segregated, their schools are going to be segregated. So this is what I was worried about as an education policy analyst. And then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision, which set me on the path that brought me here today, 11 years later. A Supreme Court decision that evaluated a plan that had been adopted by two school districts. One was Seattle, Washington, the other was Louisville, Kentucky. And in both of those school districts, the leaders of those school districts understood the conditions that I've just been describing to you, the fact that segregated schools can't possibly have the same achievement as schools that aren't concentrating social and economic disadvantages, and so they tried a very token desegregation plan, both of these districts. They had a choice program. Children could choose, their parents could choose which school in the district their child would attend. But if the child's choice was going to further exacerbate the racial isolation of that school, that choice wouldn't be honored in favor of a choice of a child who had helped to desegregate the school. It was a trivial plan that both of these school districts had. If you had a school, for example, that was all white or mostly white, and there was one place left in it, and both a black and a white child applied for that last place, the black child would be given some preference as a way of helping to desegregate the school. How much more trivial a plan can you have? How often do you have one place left for a school like that? But the Supreme Court looked at this plan, they said it was unconstitutional. They said the school districts of Louisville and Seattle could not do this. And the reason they could not do this, the Supreme Court said, Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the opinion, is he said the schools can't do this because the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. Well, I thought that was a pretty wise observation on Chief Justice Roberts' part. That's that fact, why the schools are segregated in those cities. And then he went on to say that the neighborhoods are segregated de facto for all the reasons I just described, private discrimination, and government wasn't involved. And he said if you have segregation that happened by accident, de facto segregation, you're prohibited from doing anything about it. Well, I read this decision, and as you can tell, I'm an old man, so I remember some things that happened a while back. And I remembered something that happened in Louisville, Kentucky, one of the cities that this decision was involved. In Louisville, Kentucky, some years back, there was a white homeowner of a single-family home in a suburban community of Louisville called Shively, outside Louisville. And that homeowner had an African-American friend living in the center city of Louisville in a rented apartment. He was a decorated Navy veteran, the African-American friend. He had a wife and a child. He had a good job. He wanted to move to a single-family suburban home, and nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner bought a second home in his community of Shively and resold it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American friend moved into the home with his wife and daughter, an angry white mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. They dynamited the home. They firebombed it. The police were there, somehow couldn't identify a single perpetrator. No one was arrested. But when this riot was all over, someone was arrested. The white homeowner, who had sold the home to the African-American friend, was arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence for sedition, for having sold a home to an African-American in a white neighborhood. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound much like de facto segregation to me. If the police and the courts and the entire judicial system is used to maintain racial boundaries. And I began to wonder how systematic this was. Was this just an isolated case that didn't give the lie to the de facto segregation idea? Or was it more representative, more typical? And what I found in the course of the research I did over the next number of years was that there were hundreds and hundreds of these cases, thousands actually, I'm not exaggerating, thousands of cases of police-protected violence to prevent African Americans from moving into white neighborhoods. Happened very frequently in the post-war period in the 20th century. And of course, every one of those cases violated the 14th Amendment. It was a civil rights violation that needed to be remedied, never was remedied. But that not only was the judicial system and the police and the prosecutors being used to maintain racial boundaries, but there were many, many other policies of the federal and state and local governments that worked together to create, perpetuate, and reinforce racial segregation. The policies were so powerful that they've created a system today that is entirely, in my view, unconstitutional, as much a civil rights violation as any of the other forms of segregation that we abolished in the 20th century. That the myth of de facto segregation is utterly untrue. There's not a bit of truth to it. And if I'm right about this, and I hope in the next few minutes I'll persuade you that I'm right, then we have an obligation to do something about it. It's not just an option. If we want to call ourselves a constitutional democracy, we have to remedy violations of the Constitution. So let me describe some of the other policies that, I'll pick a couple. I can't go into very many of them in the little time we have, but as you know, I've written a book about this, and there are many, many policies to describe, but I'll describe a couple of the policies that were followed to create, enforce, perpetuate, and strengthen racial segregation by our government, the one that represents all of us. The first I want to talk about is public housing. Now, I know all of you think you know what public housing is, as I did. I thought it was a place that poor people live. Lots of single mothers with children. Lots of young men who are operating in the informal economy. Lots of deteriorated buildings. Lots of confrontations with the police in these projects. That's our image of public housing. That's what we think public housing is. That's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in this country during the Great Depression in the 1930s. It was a New Deal program. And it was not for poor people. It was for working families, middle-class families, people who had jobs in the Depression. We all know that there was a lot of unemployment in the Depression. That's what the Depression was. 25% of the workforce was unemployed. But 75% was working. And public housing was for that 75%. If you were poor, if you were unemployed, you couldn't get into public housing. You had to demonstrate a stable employment record. You had to demonstrate good furniture that you could move into the public housing. Public housing was for people who were working, who could afford the rent of housing, but not enough housing was available during the Depression because the construction industry had ground to a halt. The Public Works Administration, one of the first New Deal agencies, built public housing in cities all across this country, and everywhere it built it, it created segregated projects, separate projects for whites, separate projects for African Americans, frequently creating segregation in integrated communities. Now you may say, what's that, integrated communities? Well, in the mid-20th century, we had lots of integrated communities in this country. We would be stunned if we were transported back to the early 20th century to see the extent of integration there was. I don't want to exaggerate. It's not like integration was the norm. But there were many, many integrated communities, particularly working class communities in downtown areas, for the simple reason that most factories, warehouses, surface industries had to be located downtown in a central employment district because they had to be located near deep water ports or railroad terminals. That's how they got their parts and shipped their final products. There was no Federal Express then. And if they had to be located downtown, their workforces had to be living in the downtown area because workers didn't have automobiles to get to work. There were no automobiles for working class families in the early, mid-20th century, so they were walking to work from the same broad neighborhoods. So we had lots of integration, not all of it, but we had lots of integration. And the Public Works Administration segregated most of these communities, many of these communities. The great African-American novelist, playwright, poet Langston Hughes, you all have heard of him if you haven't read him. He wrote an autobiography. He described how he grew up in an integrated Cleveland downtown neighborhood. We don't think of downtown Cleveland today as being an integrated place. But he says his best friend in high school was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl. This was the nature of early 20th century downtown Cleveland. The Public Works Administration came into that integrated neighborhood in Cleveland, demolished housing, and built two separate projects, one for African Americans and one for whites, creating a pattern of segregation in downtown Cleveland, and with other projects that were also segregated elsewhere in the community, that persists to this day. It reinforced whatever informal segregation existed in that community. And the Public Works Administration did this all over the country. It did it in places that, I call them self-satisfied, smug places, places that think they're better than Battle Creek. Places like Cambridge, Massachusetts, for example. Cambridge, Massachusetts is where Harvard University and MIT are located. The area between Harvard and MIT is called the Central Square neighborhood. That was about half white, half black in the 1930s until it was half white, half black, and then the Public Works Administration demolished housing in a neighborhood to build two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating a pattern of segregation in Cambridge, and with other segregated projects elsewhere in the Boston area that persists to this day. In Berkeley, California, where I happen now to live, another smug place, there were very few African Americans living there before World War II. Many African Americans had come, obviously, to Detroit and Cleveland and Chicago and other industrial cities here in the Midwest in World War I and after. But in World War II, there were very few African Americans who were living on the West Coast. There were small numbers, some still living there from coming there during the gold rush. But very few. There were no patterns of segregation there. But in Berkeley, there was a small suburb of Berkeley just north of the city called Richmond, which was the center of Pacific Coast shipbuilding during World War II. Tiny community. By the end of the war, there were 100,000 workers in these shipyards. How does a community absorb 100,000 people, plus their families, maybe 300,000 people in a period of 4 years during the World War II? It can't. The only way the shipyards could have continued working, or anywhere else in the country, the boats and the ships, as say, and the airplanes and the tanks and the jeeps, the only way they could be produced was if the government built housing for the workers who flocked to war production from all over the country, both black and white. And everywhere, the government built segregated housing. Here in Michigan, some of you may remember the Willow Run plant that later became an automobile plant, but it was built as a war plant, and the government built housing for white workers only in Willow Run. So the African Americans couldn't work there unless somehow they could get to work living in Detroit and getting to work at the Willow Run plant. In Berkeley and Richmond, this deep water port that I mentioned, the government built housing for African American workers along the railroad tracks in the industrial area of Richmond and Berkeley. Shoddy housing, temporary housing. The government said it didn't need to build permanent housing there for the African Americans because they would have to leave at the end of the war. And it built housing for the white workers in the stable residential areas of Richmond and Berkeley and Oakland, creating a pattern of segregation there. As I say, there were very few African Americans living on the West Coast before that time, a pattern of segregation that persists to this day. And this happened everywhere on the West Coast: Portland, Seattle, the San Francisco Bay Area, Los Angeles. All of these cities came to be segregated because of the war housing projects of the federal government during World War II. After World War II, there was an enormous housing shortage, still in the country. Excuse me, during the Depression, very little housing had been built except for the projects that I described before. During World War II, it was actually against the law to build housing for civilians unless they were war workers. And then millions of war veterans were coming home after World War II needing housing. Enormous housing crisis. And President Truman, who was president at that time, proposed a vast expansion of the country's public housing program. Now remember, we're talking about housing for working families, not for poor people. These are returning war veterans who had jobs in the post-war economy, but no place to live. He proposed a vast expansion of the nation's public housing program, and conservatives in Congress wanted to defeat this program. They wanted to defeat it because they thought that public housing was socialistic. They didn't want public housing at all. And they came up with a device that some of you may have heard this term, a device that we call a poison pill strategy to defeat the 1949 Housing Act. The poison pill strategy is a strategy where opponents of a bill propose an amendment to the bill, which can get a majority. So the amendment passes. And then when the full bill comes up before Congress, that bill, as amended, inspires a different majority to oppose it. And so the entire bill goes down to defeat. So conservatives in Congress proposed an amendment to the 1949 Housing Act as follows. From now on, they said, all public housing has to be integrated. No more segregated public housing, no more racial discrimination in public housing. It was, of course, a cynical proposal. They didn't want public housing at all, but they planned to vote for this integration amendment. They thought northern liberal Congress people would vote for it as well. That would create a majority. And then when the full bill came up before Congress as a integrated public housing program, the conservatives would flip and vote against the final bill and be joined by Southern Democrats who were opposed to integrated housing but supported segregated housing, and the entire bill would go down to defeat. That was their strategy. Liberals in Congress had to decide what to do. They had to decide whether to support the integration amendment, guaranteeing that no further public housing would be built because the full bill would go down to defeat, or whether to oppose the integration amendment, understanding that the only way to continue public housing was on a segregated basis. I am not saying that they faced an easy decision. It was a tough decision. There was an enormous housing crisis. And if there's anything I talked to you about this evening that you remember from my talk, I hope it's this story, because it's the most important story I'm going to tell. They had to decide whether to support the integration amendment and no further housing would be built, even though there was an enormous housing crisis that they felt obligated to address, or oppose the integration amendment in order to get segregated public housing built. And they chose the latter course. The leading liberal in Congress at that time was a senator from Illinois. His name was Paul Douglas. He got up on the floor of Congress and made a speech along the following lines. He said, "I want to say to my Negro friends that you'll be better off if the integration amendment is defeated and your housing shortage is relieved than if the integration amendment is passed and you get no housing at all." Well, he persuaded his liberal colleagues to vote against the integration amendment. The integration amendment, therefore, was defeated by a combination of Northern and Southern Democrats. The 1949 Housing Act was then passed as a continued segregated program, and we continued to build segregated public housing across the country in the 1950s. The federal government then used that vote in Congress against the integration amendment in public housing as its justification for continuing to segregate all housing programs, not just public housing, all housing programs across the country for the next 15 years. Well, under that 1949 Housing Act, some of the giant public towers that we know as public housing were built. Probably the most famous is Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis. Perhaps you've heard of that one. Robert Taylor Homes in Chicago, or Cabrini Green in Chicago. These were segregated projects. Pruitt-Igoe actually was two separate projects. Pruitt was for African Americans, Igoe was for whites. And very soon thereafter, something happened in public housing that was quite surprising, nobody expected. And it happened everywhere across the country. Suddenly, quite suddenly, all the white projects developed large numbers of vacancies. The black projects had long waiting lists. Soon the situation became so conspicuous, no public official, no matter how bigoted the public official was, could justify a situation where in the same city you had some empty projects and others with long waiting lists. So soon all the projects were opened up to African Americans. Remember, these are working families, returning war veterans. They were all opened up to African Americans, and about the same time, something else happened in the country. About the same time, the highways were built. So the industry no longer had to be located near deep water ports, near railroad terminals, near where the public housing projects were located. Instead, it moved out to rural areas in the suburbs. The people who were living in public housing, who are now increasingly, overwhelmingly in most northern cities at the time, African American, no longer had good jobs. Industry had disappeared. They became poorer and poorer. Once they became poorer, the government had to start subsidizing their rents. The rents were no longer adequate to cover the full cost of public housing. Once the government started to subsidize it, it stopped maintaining the projects. It stopped investing in them. The projects started to deteriorate. The people became poorer, and we got the kind of public housing that we have today. The question that I hope is in your mind at this point is, why did the white projects develop all these vacancies? And the black projects have long waiting lists. Well, the white projects developed all these vacancies because of another federal program that was even more powerful in segregating the country. And that was a program of the Federal Housing Administration, another federal agency that was explicitly designed, this is a program of the federal government, designed to suburbanize the entire white urban working class population into single-family homes in all white suburbs. This was a government program. The most famous of these, perhaps, they're everywhere in the country, here in this area as well as everywhere else. The most famous of them is probably Levittown, east of New York City. You've heard of that. If you haven't heard of that, maybe you remember a song that Pete Seeger used to sing about little boxes on a hillside made of ticky-tacky, and they all look the same. That was a project just as large as Levittown, south of San Francisco. Levittown was 17,000 homes. The symbol of suburbanization in the country became to be Los Angeles in the 1950s, and places you may have heard of like Panorama City or Lakewood were also built. There were thousands of these projects built by the Federal Housing Administration for white families only, to get white families out of the cities, leaving the cities predominantly African American and poor. How did this happen? Well, I said a minute ago, Levittown was 17,000 homes. So were the little boxes on the hillside south of San Francisco, and many other projects in between were just as large and even smaller projects. Where was Levitt, the builder, going to get the capital to build 17,000 homes in one place? He didn't have any buyers for it. It was a purely speculative venture. He thought he'd be able to sell it to returning war veterans, but he didn't know. What bank would be crazy enough to lend Levitt money to build 17,000 homes for which he had no buyers yet? That's a rhetorical question. No bank would be crazy enough to lend Levitt that kind of money. The only way that Levitt or any of these other builders could get the money to build the suburbs of this country, which were built in the 1940s and 50s and into the 60s, was going to the Federal Housing Administration or to the Veterans Administration, submitting their plans for the developments for the subdivisions, the suburbs, to these federal agencies, making a required pledge to the federal agencies that they would never sell a home to a black family, agreeing to a federal requirement that a clause be placed in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was a federal policy. It wasn't the action of rogue bureaucrats. This was written in the federal policy manual of the Housing Administration, the Federal Housing Administration, that prohibited appraisers from recommending for bank guarantees, for federal bank guarantees, any subdivision that was integrated. The language, the manual even, contained a clause that prohibited, a written clause that prohibited the issuance of bank guarantees for all white developments that happened to be located near where African Americans were living. Because in the written words of the federal manual, that would run the, quote, risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said. And on this basis, all of the suburbs in this country were built in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Where did this notion of de facto segregation come from? It's lunacy. These policies that I've just described, and there were many, many others, as I say, created a white noose around black downtown areas everywhere in the country, creating the segregation that we know today. It's not that there wasn't private bigotry involved. Of course there was. The government was responding to private bigotry. But the Constitution of the United States requires the government not to respond to private bigotry. The fact that a bigoted policy, a civil rights violation is popular does not excuse our government from refusing to do it. The government is required to refuse to follow popular policies that violate civil rights. Well, those homes in the mid-20th century that the Federal Housing Administration guaranteed and subsidized to the extent that a white family could move out of public housing and move into a single-family home in the suburbs, in an all-white suburb. They would pay less in their monthly charges for an FHA or VA mortgage than they were paying for rent in public housing. That's how enormous the subsidy was. Those homes, as I began to say, sold at the time for about $100,000 in today's money. It was actually about $9,000 then. But $100,000 in inflation-adjusted terms. Any working-class family can afford to buy a home for $100,000 and could then, especially with an FHA or VA mortgage that required no down payment and a 30-year mortgage. African Americans could have afforded it as easily as whites, but African Americans were prohibited from buying these homes. Well, over the next few generations, the homes gained in value. You can't buy them anymore for $100,000. They now sell for $300,000. Levittown, they sell for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. In some parts of the country, you're up to $1 million for these homes. The white families who were subsidized by the federal government gained over the next few generations wealth from the equity that they gained in their homes, from the housing appreciation. That's where most families in this country gain their wealth. African Americans, I say, were prohibited from getting this wealth. The white families were able to use this wealth to send their children to college, to weather medical emergencies or temporary bouts of unemployment, to finance their retirements, and, most importantly, to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren who then had but down payments for their own homes. The result of this policy, this housing policy of the federal government, was the following. Today, African American incomes, on average, are about 60% of white incomes. There's another whole story behind the income gap. I won't test your patience by spending another hour talking about how that happened. But 60% income ratio. You would think that if there's a 60% income ratio, African Americans having about 60% of the wealth of income on average, that there would also be a 60% wealth ratio. But the reality is that while there's a 60% income ratio, African Americans on average have wealth only 10% of whites. And that enormous disparity, the enormous gap between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that we have never remedied in this country. And the wealth gap, as you know, is the single biggest determinant of ongoing inequality between African Americans and whites in this country today. It's what keeps most African Americans in less valuable homes, in deteriorated neighborhoods. And it predicts many of the social problems that we have today. Racial segregation is not just wrong, immoral, harmful. It underlies the most serious problems that we face in this country today. I started out talking to you this evening about the academic achievement gap in schools. That's a product. We spend a lot of time in fruitless school reform, when the real cause is residential segregation. It underlies the big health disparities we have between African Americans and whites. Shorter life expectancies for African Americans, greater rates of heart disease and diabetes from living in less healthy neighborhoods. We spend a lot of time on public health programs, never addressing the underlying cause, which is racial segregation. It certainly underlies and predicts the outrageous mass incarceration and criminal justice or injustice system that we have today, which frequently end up in violent confrontations between police and young African-American men who are living in neighborhoods, concentrated in neighborhoods without access to jobs or even transportation to good jobs. And I suggest that racial segregation also underlies something else. It underlies the very, very dangerous, frightening to me, political polarization in this country, which tracks racial lines. Because how can we ever develop a common national identity, which is essential to a democratic society, if African Americans and whites, so many of them, are living so far distant from one another that they have no ability to develop a common national identity, to develop empathy and understanding for each other's life experiences? It's a frightening and dangerous trend, which we need to do something about. Well, I hope I've persuaded you that we do not have de facto segregation. I hope I've persuaded you that since the residential boundaries, the racial boundaries of areas across the country are violations of civil rights, are violations of the Constitution, that we have an obligation to remedy it, an obligation to do something about it as American citizens, all of us, black and white. We have an obligation to develop a new civil rights movement that's going to pick up where the last one left off and address this most serious remaining legacy of slavery, the racial segregation of neighborhoods. Now, there are many, many policies that we could follow that would redress segregation. In my book, as those of you who've read it know, I have a small chapter about what those policies are. I don't spend a lot of time talking about them because we're not ready to adopt them. We don't have the political will, the national consensus, the new civil rights movement that's going to force our elected representatives to undo the damage that we've done. We need such a civil rights movement in order to get the job done, and it's a little bit foolish to spend a lot of time debating the nuances of policies that we could follow because we're not ready to follow those policies yet. So let me describe, but I will describe just a few of them to give you an idea of what we might do if we had the political will, if we did have a new civil rights movement that was as aggressive as the civil rights movements that we had in the past to solve this problem. We should, for example, be subsidizing African Americans to move into neighborhoods that are now unaffordable to them in the same way that we subsidize whites to do so in the mid-20th century. I mentioned Levittown. Homes there now sell for $300,000, $400,000. African Americans, very few African Americans living in Levittown today because they couldn't buy into it when it was affordable. The federal government should be buying up some homes in Levittown, places like Levittown, at market rates, $300,000, $400,000, whatever it is, and reselling it to qualified African Americans for $100,000. That would be a narrowly targeted remedy for a specific constitutional violation, which, if we understood this history, would be constitutionally defensible. In fact, mandated. We could prohibit the kind of zoning rules that many, many suburbs have adopted across the country in order to preserve segregation, that prohibit the construction even of single-family homes on modest lot sizes or townhouses. We could stop subsidizing, or at least use the subsidy as a leverage, homeowners in all white neighborhoods with the mortgage interest deduction, so long as their communities preserve segregation. And we could stop using programs for low-income families to perpetuate and reinforce segregation. Remember the story I told you before about Paul Douglas and the terrible dilemma he faced. We face that same dilemma today. We have an enormous housing shortage. Where do we build most of our affordable housing? Well, we build it in already low-income segregated neighborhoods, reinforcing its segregation, because it's easier to build there, just as it was easier to build public housing that was segregated. It's easier to build affordable housing in low-income neighborhoods because the land is cheaper, because there's no community opposition. A builder doesn't have to hold 100 community meetings explaining why he's bringing black and brown people into your neighborhood. We could stop doing that. We could change those programs to require that mixed-income housing be built throughout the community, not just in low-income neighborhoods. So there are many policies we could follow. We're not going to do it until we develop the national will. Let me conclude by saying this. In the course of writing this book, I not only did research in the history, but I decided I would look into how we teach this history to high school students today in this country. And what I found is we lie about it. All of the most commonly used high school textbooks in this country lie about this history. The most commonly used high school textbook at the time I wrote the book, the time I was doing this research, it was probably about 4 years ago, was something called The Americans. I don't know if any of your children use it or your grandchildren or you've seen it, but it's about 1,200 pages of American history. There's one paragraph in that book that's subheaded Discrimination in the North. In that paragraph, there's one sentence about housing, and the sentence goes as follows. In the North, African Americans found themselves forced into segregated housing. That's what it says. You know, they woke up one morning, looked out the window, and they said, hey, look at this, we're in segregated housing. That's how it happened. Really, that's what we're teaching our young people. That's what we're teaching our young people. And if our young people don't learn this history any better than we've learned it, they're going to be in as poor a position to remedy as we've been. So one thing that everybody can do, because everybody in this room and everybody that I know in every place I go to has either children or grandchildren or nieces and nephews in the schools. We know teachers and principals and superintendents and school board members. We can try to change the way in which this history is taught to create an accurate history. I was telling some people earlier today over dinner that I'm working with a group of people now to try to design a national committee to redress segregation in housing, and we'll be ready to announce it perhaps at the end of the year. And that committee will have a menu of activities like this that people can undertake in communities all across the country to begin the conversation about how to remedy this civil rights violation. I guarantee you, if you start a conversation about how this history is taught in schools, that conversation will leak out into the adult community. So I want to thank you for your attention, and I'd be glad to engage in discussion and answer questions as any of you may have them. Thank you very much. Hi.
Hi there. We've been collecting questions from the audience, so we're gonna, we really only have time for probably 2 to 3 questions. So we're trying to do our best to group these together, spur the moment.
Did I run my mouth too long?
No, you were great. You were great. We just wanted to pack a lot into your visit. So I'm gonna start off with one question. A private investor is developing 50 high-level housing units in downtown Battle Creek that is also funded with federal dollars. How can this community influence them to include public housing units?
Well, my answer to that is we don't want to include only public housing units. What we want to include is units in every development that have a mixture of housing of all levels, not just high level, but we don't want a development like that which has just high-level housing and low-level housing. We want a representation of the community, a mixed thing. And there's an enormous housing shortage in this country, not just for poor people, but even for middle-class people. young people who can't afford to buy homes because the housing prices are so high in many places. So what we need, and again, this goes back to what I said before, is we're not ready to enact these policies, but we need something not only in Battle Creek, but throughout the state of Michigan and throughout the country, which we call inclusionary zoning, which requires any development that's built to have a mix of different income levels housing, so that we can have representative housing throughout the country. There are places that do this, not very many. It's not as though this is a crazy idea, though. There are places that do it, and there's a very affluent suburb outside Montgomery County, in Montgomery County, which is outside Washington, D.C. Very, very affluent community. They have an inclusionary zoning ordinance. They require a builder of any development in Montgomery County to set aside 15% of the units. I think it should be more, but 15% of the units for moderate income families. And that of that 15%, the Public Housing Authority buys 1/3 of them. So 5% of the units in any development in Montgomery County are for public housing eligible families. So that's the kind of policy we should develop, and we need to develop an understanding and political support for it.
Thank you.
I see a theme of a couple of them that's asking, basically, what can we do to move forward? How can the average citizen help correct this nationwide problem? What should the first step be? And what tangible things local communities can do to undo de jure segregation?
Okay, what's the first step? Well, I just mentioned one. We should make sure that our schools are teaching this history accurately so we can begin to develop a new consensus around the obligation to remedy it. On your chairs, you also have another first step, an easy step to do, which is to attach quitclaim language to your deeds. That doesn't remove the restrictive covenants. I don't necessarily think that's a good idea. I think people should be reminded of our history, but that instead denounces it and makes a pledge that we welcome people of all races and ethnicities in our community. So that's another step. As I mentioned a minute ago, I'm hoping that over the course of the next year or so, we will have the beginnings of a national committee to redress segregation in housing, which will have a full menu of activities that the local groups can do, and we'll be trying to form local groups that range from starting with something like the school curriculum and going up to inclusionary zoning and some of the other policies I talked about. And when we're ready to announce that, I'm going to beg Amanda for all the email addresses of the people who signed up to attend here tonight so we can announce it and invite you to join.
Okay, another question is probably directed at what the real estate agents can do right away to help towards this change, and for you to address some best practices for the realtors, city government, and other entities.
Well, we did pass in 1968 a Fair Housing Act, which prohibits discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. And that Fair Housing Act has been enforced, not rigidly enforced, but enforced. But one thing that I think the real estate agents can do and associations of realtors can do is to make sure that they're recruiting African-American real estate agents who can market homes for sale in middle-class communities to qualified African-Americans. There are many of them living in segregated middle-class African-American communities who could well afford to move into middle-class communities that are beginning to be integrated. And an integrated realtor corps can do a better job of integrating communities without the kinds of subsidies that I mentioned before, and that's going to take much heavier policy. We're not going to be able to do very much along those lines, but we can take small steps in that direction.
I want to add to that. As a Fair Housing Deputy Director, you can also come to my training. So get in touch with my colleague, Charlie Cook-McCough, and sign up for a training if you want to know more about how not to discriminate. Another question is about policy and suits.
Can I just ask you your question?
Yes.
Do you have a testing program?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Do you have enough testers?
It depends on what area we're testing in, who gives us funding to do the testing. Then we'll go out and hire the core people that we need to do the testing.
Okay.
So you never know when you're being tested.
Okay.
Another question, has there been any class action suits filed over this housing discrimination issue? What are the most progressive responses we can take to counteract this?
Well, there have been some suits filed and some have been successful, but mostly this can't be solved with lawsuits. It can only be solved with the kinds of policy programs that I described, and certainly, I'm not trying to put civil rights lawyers out of business. If we adopted any of those policies that I described, for example, a subsidy program to African Americans, somebody would challenge them, so the civil rights lawyers would be kept busy defending them. But you can't get those kinds of policies by court order. They have to be done as a result of a change in public opinion, and that result in legislation and ordinances and public policies. There are some suits that we've had that have been successful. Some public housing authorities have been successfully sued for racial discrimination. Places like Chicago and Baltimore and Dallas and a number of other places around the country. Once once public housing projects became predominantly African American, after whites were subsidized to leave to move to the suburbs, then those public housing authorities placed all their public housing projects as they were building in African American neighborhoods, further reinforcing segregation, and those lawsuits succeeded in getting settlements as a result of that practice. There was a lawsuit in Dallas that went up to the Supreme Court a few years ago, which challenged the very fact that I was talking about before, the fact that subsidized low-income housing projects were being built almost only in low-income segregated neighborhoods in Dallas. And the Supreme Court said that that kind of practice could be a violation of the Fair Housing Act. And as a result of that decision, not enough, but more low-income housing projects in the Dallas area are now being placed in integrated communities.
Thank you. That's the last question.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Okay, now we want to make this a bit more personal. We've invited 3 individuals to give their personal testimonies, so I'd like to invite Pastor Joe Hooper, Beverly Kelly, and Talia Chapman to share their testimonies with us tonight.
Okay, good evening. My name is Elder Hooper, and we have heard great things from Richard Rothstein about the governmental institutional policies that has impacted our community and led us where we are here today. In order to be more intentional in creating a non-segregated, non-discriminating community, that beloved community, that community that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. so often talked about. We must understand the how and why of how we got here. Yes, although we have legislated equality all the way up to the Supreme Court, as mentioned, the beloved community is today right here in this community, has not been realized. We have personal stories to share that will illustrate that. Yes, today the policies of the past are with us today. You will hear from a Battle Creek community, longtime residents, Beverly Kelly, and you'll hear from a local realtor, Talia Chapman, who has served our community. And yes, I have a story too. My story begins in 2008. I moved my family here to Battle Creek, my wife Shamel, my daughter Kaylin, and we came from Southfield, Michigan. Back to Battle Creek, my hometown, where I graduated from Central. Go Bearcats. Right. I was blessed to be able to help my mother continue to live in her home as her health began to decline. So after a few years or so, my wife began to look around for a home. Soon we found a home that we were interested in purchasing and began to seek financing. Our first stop was to our banking institution. There we were told it was too much house for us, and we had to find another house for about half that price that we was requesting. Needless to say, we were disappointed, and we began to look around for a less expensive house. So after viewing several other houses and homes, we came back to our previous interests. Just kind of a nice fit, you know. We searched around and found another lender that gave us a preliminary thumbs up. We began to communicate and complete the process of securing financing. Over the course of about 3 months, we went through our credit history, income, etc. You know the story, your life, you know. And so everything seems to be okay. So we're excited now. We've been mentally packing already, you know. So all they needed was inspection and a last little bit of paperwork. And so afterwards, we were told then we would be ready to go for our closing date. We were excited. I decided to take that last request in personally myself. So we heard nothing from them for about a week. After another week, we didn't hear anything. So we called. We called and got that, well, didn't you get that message? Oh, that was strange. They said we couldn't go any farther on this case. So they dropped us just like that. We felt very disappointed. We had received numerous of communications from them saying that, oh, we're with you. Everything is going to be just fine. One example was that an airplane, they used the expression that if something happens in the air, don't worry, we got you. We'll help you get down to the ground safely. And a lot of confidence we had in them. But we were now in our house. We've been there for 6 years. We secured a mortgage from another agency, and we were pleased and satisfied with the treatment that we got. So that process took about 3 months. But I'm a part of the Human Relations Board, and I was sitting in a meeting where we heard the discrimination investigation research. And then as I began to hear the details, then it became clear to me that I had been a victim of discrimination practices. So that's my story. And let me bring to you Beverly Kelly. Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor Joe. I am Beverly Kelly, and I am the Executive Director of Habitat, but that is not why I'm standing here tonight. I was invited to be a part of this committee because I was the Executive Director, but reading this book has transformed me. So I'm here as someone who grew up in Battle Creek. But I want to begin by telling the story about the Bottoms. And I'm not very familiar with this story as much as I would like to be, but it was in the neighborhood where most of the car dealerships are now on Dickman Road and where Dickman Road is. And during World War II, it hosted the Hamblin Community Center. And after the war, and that was the place to be. In this neighborhood, you lived, played, and went to school with your neighbors, and color didn't matter at all. Then in 1947, there was a flood, and the city government decided to reroute the Kalamazoo River as a part of the master plan to upgrade the city's aging infrastructure and redevelop neighborhoods. And this would prevent further flooding. The final component of this master plan was referred to as Slum Clearance and Redevelopment Plan. Determining slum neighborhoods had more to do with color than the conditions of the home. At this time, the large homes in Washington Heights, the north part of town, they were turned into apartments, and the displaced were encouraged to move there. This controlled where the low-income minority families went. I moved to Battle Creek in 1964, and my parents purchased a home on Main Street. My 5 siblings and I knew we were blessed to live in a home where everyone was welcome, and we became the gathering place for neighborhood children. I was also aware that my father's job allowed us many opportunities my friends did not have. We learned the blessing of sharing with others and understanding we were all equal in God's eyes. I watched some of my friends move out of post-addition to homes in Lakeview. Since I was happy in my neighborhood, I assumed everyone else lived there because they chose to. I watched the demographics change in post-addition, and I didn't realize that it was just the Caucasians who moved on to bigger and better homes. I didn't think anything was wrong when my father's co-workers commented on our choice to live in post-addition. The reading of this book has transformed me and actually made me angry. I lived in a neighborhood where only Caucasians could move to Lakeview because the property in Lakeview was deeded that it could not be sold to a non-Caucasian. This is what the deeds actually said. No persons of any race other than Caucasian race shall use or occupy any premises or any part thereof in said subdivision, except that this provision shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race domiciled with an owner or tenant. When I believe minority families chose to stay in post-addition, I didn't understand they stayed because they had no other choice. When I saw my Lakeview friends move once again to even larger homes, I didn't realize that their property values increased around 40% in a decade, when my minority friends in post-addition might have seen a 4% increase in the same time. They stayed in post-addition because their property values were so low, they couldn't use their home as an investment to enable them to move on to a different home. My family was transferred to California a year after I graduated from high school, and I remember my father's concern that he was selling our home close to the same price we paid for it, even though we had put in thousands of dollars of improvement. My father had less equity to purchase a home in California than his Lakeview co-workers who were also transferred. By educating myself, I have learned that from 1973 to 1980, the African American median wage fell by 1%, while the average American house price grew by 43%. Now that was 43%, but their wage median fell by 1%. As I say this to you right now, all I can think is, are you kidding me? I thought we were equal. And this didn't just happen in post-addition. Washington Heights had the same thing. I took government and history in school and learned of past sins. I also learned how we freed the slaves and we were all equal. I trusted our government because I believed they honored human beings and had learned to fight discrimination when the Jewish were killed in World War II. I was wrong and am mortified that I have obtained greater wealth than my childhood friends because of the color of my skin. The property in Lakeview stayed deeded the way I read it until 1968, when the fair housing laws were passed. Most properties still say this in the original deed. I'm proud that I lived in Post Edition, and I have great memories and have lifelong friendships. I'm angry that I lived with all this injustice around me, and I didn't do anything because I simply didn't know. I'm angry that my friends and I all received the same education, Battle Creek Central, but some didn't have the same opportunities to put the knowledge to better their lives. I ask myself today, what is happening right now that I could change if I knew the story and took action? Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for choosing to be here tonight. And I really don't think that I need to add too much to what we've already heard. You heard that there was a pre-event last week, and Richard, your book also changed me. And I just want to say, or echo something that somebody else said last week at the meeting. I didn't create this situation, but nothing will change unless I commit to being part of the change. And now I know better, so I'm going to do better. Thank you.